We left off last time talking about the distinction between political and paternal power. And the question arises, if political and paternal power really are as distinct as night and day, why are people like Robert Filmer always getting too confused and coming up with wild inventions like Adam as the first father king? Where the idea is political and paternal power are basically the same. And Locke says the reasons are pretty historical. Because at one point, back in the state of nature, the same person, in fact, may have wielded both paternal and political power. However, they would have wielded those kinds of powers for different reasons. So in the same way, in our contemporary world, you could think of an individual who's both a mother and an accountant. That doesn't mean the power of the mother and the power of an accountant are the same things. It just means that those two powers happen to coincide in one person. And Locke is saying the same thing was going on with the power of being a father and the power of being let's call it a chief of a village. So let's imagine that there's a family, the Locke family. And the Locke family goes through the generations. There's 5 or 6 kids in the first generation of kids, and those kids grow up and go on to have 5 or 6 kids of their own. Pretty soon, you haven't got a family, a household in the state of nature. What you've got is more like a village. And you can imagine if 2 of Locke's sons, say Johnny Jr. and Tommy, started getting into some kind of property conflict. Let's say that Johnny Jr. used to work on this land and put a lot of labor into it and cultivated it, and then hasn't worked on it for years. And Tommy decided, well, that land is just lying in waste now. Why don't I go work on it? And eventually the 2 sons start to clash over that plot of land. And as you can see here, it's not exactly clear who owns it. So instead of trying to judge the law of nature themselves, they go to their father, whom they are used to obeying, because that's what they did when they were a kid, whose authority they respect, and who both sons agree has good judgment. It would make a good judge in this case. What's going on in this case? Well, somebody besides the individuals themselves is now trying to suss out who owns that property according to the law of nature. And while Papa Locke in this scenario is not up on a throne, and he hasn't got a huge bureaucracy under him, and he hasn't got a police force and so forth, he is exercising something like political power because he's standing in here as a kind of judge. So let's call him chief of this village. In this case, Locke says, Papa Locke is little more than an executor of the law of nature. He's judging how the law of nature should apply to this plot of land, and then he's executing his judgment. Okay. In the second example, imagine that Johnny Jr. and Tommy are off riding their horses or wandering through the woods, and they come across another village, and this village is up in arms about something. And they hear the villagers chanting, "Get the Locks, get the Locks, go get the Locks," or something like to that effect. And what they realize, the sons realize, is that this other village is mobilizing for war against the Locke village. So they rush back to the village and they say, well, who's in charge here? Let's put Papa Locke in charge because he's kind of the elder male of this village. People already kind of treat him like a chief. He already has quasi-governmental functions. And so wouldn't it be natural for Papa Locke to lead this village and mobilize the adults here and get them armed and fortify the defenses and so forth? So what's going on in this scenario? Well, the father has assumed command of the village during wartime. It's a temporary situation, though. There's no standing armies, there's no uniforms, there's no whatever. It's just a father who happens to be something like a commander-in-chief for this village. And Locke says, in this scenario, Papa Locke is acting like little more than the general of an army. And once again, it's a temporary thing. There's no huge military bureaucracy. There's no army ranks or whatever. So in this way, Locke says, you can imagine how conjugal societies or families gradually became civil societies or societies living under something like government. Because the eldest male around, who was kind of revered for his age and his wisdom, would eventually start acquiring more and more political power. And eventually you would take that chief or commander-in-chief and turn them into a king-like figure. Okay, and eventually you've got something like a government or a state. But notice what happens in both examples, when the father becomes a common judge or the father assumes wartime command. In both examples, the reason that this father wields political power is not because he's a father. It's because he had the consent of those who were under his power to wield that political power. In other words, the father only took on king-like powers due to the consent of the governed. You can see that argument laid out in paragraph 111, page 63. We don't have time to go into it right now. And this argument that government power, political power, is only legitimately exercised over those who have consented to be governed by that political power is an answer to a very vexing question for Locke. The vexing question is, if we really are born free and equal in the state of nature, why in the world would we ever leave the state of nature and start giving our capacities to judge the law of nature, to execute the law of nature, to basically govern ourselves? Why would we give those capacities up to somebody else, somebody like a Papa Locke, somebody like a king, somebody like a parliament? Why would we give those powers up, those powers of self-govern up, and start being governed by or even ruled by other people? Why should any born free, born equal individual obey any other? And Locke has a very simple answer, and we've already seen it a couple times. It's because they've consented. Another way of putting it is they've contracted. Another way of putting it is because that's what they signed up for. So Locke's claim is the only reason that any full-grown adult is subject to the power and the authority of any other full-grown adult is because they contracted. And so you can think into the contemporary situation and ask yourself, why would Locke say that if you signed an employment contract that your boss, and remember here, boss is derived from the Dutch word for master, your master at your workplace can tell you what to do basically for 9 hours a day. Why can they do that? Well, Locke would say you've actually made a very simple bargain or a very simple calculation of your interests. You would like something from the boss. You would like security, in this case, economic security, because one of the only ways to get economic security in a society like ours, a commercial society, a market-based society, is steady employment. Steady employment. So you wanted economic security. And in return for that economic security, you were willing to trade away some of your freedom from this time in the day till that time in the day. You basically have to listen to the boss, do what the boss says, respect the boss' authority, at least for that specified period of time. So you gave up some of your freedoms in order to get some of that security. That's the basic intuition behind all of Locke. that these social hierarchies where people have power are exercising power over you and are governing you, except in the case of parents and children, is grounded on consent or contract, and those are used almost interchangeably for Locke. So political power is also founded on consent and contract. What is political power? Well, first of all, political power is a right of the civil government. It is what a civil government rightfully exercises. When the civil government exercises this political power entails a corresponding duty on the part of the subject to obey. So civil governments, if they're legitimate, if they're truly civil governments, they make legitimate demands on the obedience of the subject. Now, what is this political power? Well, as we saw on Monday, political power works through the laws. So you've got to have laws before you can judge controversies according to law. You've got to have laws before you can enforce laws. So what is the primary thing that a civil government has to do? It has to write laws. It has to write laws. So there is something Locke is going to call the legislative power. As we've also seen throughout the Locke lectures, whether we're talking about the laws of nature or the laws of a government, Locke's idea is that laws have to have consequences attached to them, and laws have to have especially negative consequences attached to law breaking. You can go back to that example in the state of nature where Locke says you can kill a thief who's trying to take your property, because that's the basic idea behind what the government will do, not you as an individual. That was back in the state of nature. What the government will do in a civil society. It will enforce the laws with penalties up to death. Doesn't mean every infraction of the criminal law leads straight to death. It just means the government has the right to execute people, basically, while it's executing the law. And when it executes the law, now we're on the second part of this line. When it does execute the law, it's not exercising a personal power. It's exercising impersonal power. It's exercising government power. It's using society's force, not the force of some arbitrary, willful individual. Okay, so at least that's the idea of Locke. The laws are relatively neutral rules for governing social interactions. When people break these relatively neutral and impartial rules, they deserve punishment in a relatively neutral and impartial fashion. So it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, what languages you speak, or ethnicity and race, gender, any of that. According to Locke, the law should not take those differences into account in order to maintain this relative impartiality. Locke says that there's one big purpose to writing up these laws and executing the laws. There's one big point to exercising legislative power and executive power, and that is regulating and securing property. So we talked last time about how, for example, the body, what Locke calls life, that life as a kind of property would be secured. We also talked about how Locke would try and secure possessions, including possessions like intellectual property right. Here, I would look at the liberties part, because you remember this formula Locke has: life, liberty, estates, and possessions. Liberties. How would you secure liberties as a property? And the idea is something like, if there happen to be liberties of speech or liberties to vote, and those are recognized by the law, say the constitutional law, it is the obligation of the government to protect those liberties rather than violating those liberties. So, for example, if somebody is trying to prevent somebody from speaking or prevent somebody from voting, and by civil law, they have rights to do both of those things, well, then you've got an aggressor who is probably trying to stop them from speaking or stop them from voting. And you see the whole system breaks down, according to Locke, if the government itself is the aggressor. At that point, the government is no longer protecting liberties, but rather trying to take liberties that are defined by law and protected by law away. At that point, the government is no longer exercising political power. At that point, they're exercising what Locke is going to call despotic power. So you've got to protect these properties. And once again, in the expansive sense, life, liberty, estates, and property. Estates and possession against internal threats. So if there are groups in your society which are trying to take away the right to vote, right to speak, trying to take away people's lives, trying to take away people's houses, intellectual copyrights, and so forth, they're the internal threats. And there's no difference really with the external threats. If it happens to be foreign spies or foreign theft or foreign whatever, it doesn't matter. The threats are threats. The main thing is that they're threats. It doesn't matter if they're coming from within. It doesn't matter if they're coming from without. Locke, chapters 9 through 14. I want to talk about two things. The first is Locke's original compact. And then the second, I'm probably not going to be able to get to. It's the institutional powers compared. I'm going to talk about the federative, the prerogative, the legislative, and the executive powers. Okay. What is in John Locke's original contract? Well, before we talk about the content of the social contract, before we talk about the clauses that are in the social contract, let's see why Locke thinks we should leave the state of nature where we're governing ourselves and get into a civil society where we're being governed by others. The state of nature has certain problems. In Locke's languages, it's got inconveniences. So it's not a horror show. State of nature is not the state of war where everyone's basically using force without right and trying to kill each other all the time. Remember, he thinks state of nature and state of war are different, but he does think that the state of nature is imperfect. It's inconvenient. There are certain things that could be better. And Locke's wager is things are overall better in civil society. All these inconveniences are related to imperfections in human nature. So I'm going to skip verification. Hopefully this will work. I'm having technical difficulties today. But you can see here, there's a quote here by the founder, James Madison. And this is the basic Lockean idea. I'm not saying Madison got it from Locke. But what I am saying is people in the Anglophone, the English-speaking world, around the 17th and 18th centuries, Locke's and Madison's respective times, this was a commonplace. If men were angels, no government were necessary. If you want to put this back in Locke speak, the idea is if humans were perfect, there would be no need of civil society. So how are human beings imperfect? Well, the basic imperfection is we're self-interested, and that's good, but sometimes we take our self-interest too far, and it starts to harm other people or lead to inconveniences. So the first problem of the state of nature is it's lacking something. It's lacking a known, settled law. There is a law of nature, and this law of nature is given by God. And if you just use your reason, if you just think about it, Locke thinks you can arrive at the conclusion that there is a law of nature not to harm other people. However, Locke also knows that we're biased, and we're often biased in our own case. So imagine that there are two neighbors in the state of nature. Let's call one rational and industrious Susan, and let's call the other quarrelsome and contentious Tommy. And Susan is growing a crap ton of pumpkins on her land because she's out there working every day, cultivating land, pulling up leaves, getting rid of the bugs and so forth. There's just a huge pumpkin patch. And Tommy, he grows some food. Sometimes he works, sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he's full and sometimes he's hungry. And then he realizes that he can sneak over to Susan's plot of land at night and take a few pumpkins, and he figures, she's got more than enough and plenty. And I can just have a pumpkin or two. I didn't have to work for it, but that's okay because Susan's working for both of us. And he sneaks over without her consent and steals the pumpkins. Quarrelsome and contentious Tommy is this biased individual who's decided that he's special. He doesn't have to work for his pumpkins. He can just take pumpkins from somebody who's working more than him. Okay, so that's problem number one. Here's another problem. When Susan wakes up the next day and sees that a couple pumpkins are gone and looks over at her neighbor who's having a pumpkin feast, she realizes what's happened. She can go over, and according to the law of nature, she's got rights of reparations. She's able to say, Tommy, you stole 2 or 3 pumpkins. I need 2 or 3 pumpkins back, and maybe 3 or 4 pumpkins, because now you distracted me from doing my pumpkin cultivation, and I had to come over here and have this long argument with you about my pumpkins. You're wasting my time. Give me 3 or 4 pumpkins. And then the problem, what's the problem? There's no impartial judge. As you see here, both parties to the conflict are judging the justice of the cause. There's no one outside of the conflict. There's no third party who doesn't have a horse in the race. Both parties in the conflict have a horse in the race. And so it would be fine if Susan just said, give me 3 or 4 pumpkins. But no, individuals are biased towards themselves. Susan's going to say, I need 100 pumpkins, which is ironic because when another neighbor, let's call him Johnny, when he had his pumpkins stolen by Tommy, Susan said, oh, that's terrible. You should go ask for your 3 or 4 pumpkins back. So here's the problem. If individuals are self-interested to the point where they misapply the natural law, you've got a situation where they're going to want more than enough, more than their due when it comes to reparations for themselves, yet not enough when it comes for other people. Okay, finally, there's often no executive force. There's no power you can put behind the law of nature. Because you remember, one thing that political power does is it puts the force of the entire society, a kind of force that the entire society has actually authorized, behind the execution of the law. In the state of nature, all individuals are trying to enforce the natural law on other people. So if there are punishments, if quarrelsome and contentious Tommy happens to be really big and strong, and when he goes and steals pumpkins from Johnny, from Susan, from whoever, they have to come and try and get those pumpkins back from a guy who loves to argue and who is really strong. And there may be many cases, Locke imagines, where Susie and Tommy can't get their pumpkins back. They can't get reparations back, and guess what? They're too weak to forcefully take the pumpkins that are theirs back. So this is the problem of individuals may be too weak to execute the law of nature. Okay, so civil society is going to be a way of making up for the imperfections of human nature. Civil society would not be necessary if we were perfect, if men were angels, as Madison puts it. Instead, what you're going to have in civil society is government institutions. You're going to have political power, which makes up for and remedies some of these inconveniences in the state of nature. Okay, so now we've come to the contrast between the state of nature and civil society. And Locke is going to show us all the ways, or the big relevant ways, that the state of nature and civil society differ. Let's talk about the first way. The first way is really just review. Locke says the state of nature has one law of nature. The law of nature is the species shall not be harmed. More positively put, the law of nature is that the species shall be preserved. Civil society also has one big purpose, which is property preservation. Property preservation in the sense of preserving life, liberties, estates, and properties. Estates and possessions, sorry. And as you saw, this idea is extremely important for Locke. The reason that you have government is to secure property, to regulate property relations. Okay, so that's just some quick review. This is also review. The state of nature has got institutions. The state of nature is actually fairly robust. You've got conjugal societies or families in the state of nature. As you can hear, conjugal societies, Locke thinks the ultimate purpose of the family is to raise children, to have children, raise them up, to educate them, and transmit property to them. These families have private property. So you've got the household accumulation of wealth. So you've got individuals, but they're not just accumulating for themselves. These individuals belong to families. And so you've got notions of household wealth. And when it comes to property transmission, the parents have got to figure out how to pass the property down and so forth. And these individuals who belong to families in the state of nature, prior to any government, already have inventions like money and the institution of money and the market where you can trade money for goods and services. Okay, so you can see here, all this, according to Locke, can happen without a government existing. All this can come about and arise spontaneously out of the state of nature, and maybe by custom and maybe by spontaneity, some combination of invention and habit. All this arises without a government. What does civil society do? Civil society adds one crucial institution. You've pretty much got a full-blown society in the state of nature. What is it missing? It's missing government. And so civil society comes about to fill that gap and to meet that need. Meet the need for a government with the main powers here, legislative and executive. And as we'll see on Friday, there are other kinds of powers that Locke discusses, but the big powers are the legislative power and the executive power. Locke is going to say the legislative power is the most important because, remember, you can't execute laws, you can't enforce laws until you write laws. Okay, so the government is going to be in charge of law. It's going to use the law to protect property in the broadest sense, life, liberties, estates, possessions. There's big differences when it comes to the powers in the state of nature and the civil society. In the state of nature, only God legislates. No individual can go around making new laws for other people. And the point here is there's really only one law in the state of nature. And as we've seen in Locke's imagination, individuals have to judge violations of the natural law, and individuals have to execute the natural law, try and get punishment and reparations when they can. So God's the legislator, individual's the judge, individual executes the law. Things are different in civil society because the whole point is you need a legislator. The government becomes the legislator, and it's not just one law. There's a whole bunch of laws, and this as a whole is called civil law. Civil law, let's be clear, is not what lawyers mean by it. Lawyers talk about civil law versus criminal law. That's not what Locke's talking about. Locke is just talking about law in a civil society. So any law that goes through the right procedures and comes from the right authority, that's law. Government makes the civil law. Individuals aren't judging the law anymore. If two individuals have some conflict with each other, yes, they can resolve it by themselves. But if it comes to the point where they can't resolve it by themselves, now you've got the third party. Now you've got the government. And the government, you can think of the government as a kind of umpire. The umpire is supposed to enforce the rules in a way that is not partial towards one side or another. And the idea is the umpire in, say, a baseball game or whatever, can say who's out and who's safe and so forth fairly because they haven't got a horse in the race. They are not one of the players. So the government's not a player. The government is a judge outside of the play of market interactions and so forth, and can judge the law impartially. And the same goes for the execution of the law. If the government says this and that penalty shall be attached to violating this and that law, it has to impartially enforce the law. It can't be prejudiced against certain individuals based on personal whim. It can't be prejudiced based on social discrimination, social categories. Okay, so that's the idea of the government. And what do we notice about the change from the state of nature to civil society? What is the change in the status of the individual? Well, in the state of nature, you've got natural freedom. Your freedom to do whatever you see fit within the boundaries of the natural law. You've also got natural equality, which, as we remember, Locke described as a kind of equal jurisdiction over every other member of the state of nature, where you can judge violations and try and punish violations. Okay, and those are the defining characteristics of the state of nature. That's what's emphasized. Emphasized is your natural freedom and your natural equality. You've got a natural obligation, and Locke doesn't make a big deal out of this because that's not the point of the state of nature. The point of state of nature is you're free and equal, and that's why Robert Filmer and others who think they're father kings and so forth, that's why they're wrong. But there is an obligation. The obligation is don't break the law. And the obligation is punish violations of the law. So your obligations are legal, just like your equality, just like your freedom. In civil society, you've got a very different case. What's emphasized is civil obligation. What's emphasized is your obedience to the government. If the government is put together in the right way, and if the government is actually doing its job, you have to follow the law. Your obligation is to follow this legal authority. Locke doesn't mention this because, once again, this is not what he's after. He's after civil obligation. Locke doesn't mention this, but you have civil liberties. And if you think Locke is all about civil liberties, I challenge you. He never uses the phrase, find it. It's not there. He doesn't talk about freedoms of speech, for example. He doesn't even talk about freedom to vote. He doesn't even talk about voting rights and so forth. Okay, so that's not there. But it is implicitly, it's implicitly there because that's what he means by liberties. And once again, these are defined by civil law. Okay, he also thinks there's such thing as civil equality. Now, civil equality cannot be natural equality. Natural equality was equal jurisdiction under the natural law. Civil equality, you don't have jurisdiction over another person. Sorry, if you're just a private citizen. You only have jurisdiction if you're a government official. Because remember, you gave up that natural equality to get civil equality. What civil equality really comes down to in a civil society is being equal before the law, knowing that the law is not going to treat you differently than any other individual. And to know that in your civil society, no individual is above the law. And that includes government officials. If the subject has to follow the law, so does the government official or the magistrate, that's Locke's language for it. The magistrate has got to follow the law as well. Nobody can break the law. And that once again comes down to the impartiality of the civil law. The civil law cannot be biased in favor of government officials. It cannot be biased in favor of private citizens. Okay, but the main thing again is civil obligations. So why have I drawn this arrow? Because what Locke is saying is when you move from the state of nature to civil society, what you're actually doing is moving from a state of natural freedom and natural equality to a state of civil obligation. Another way of putting it is signatories to the social contract, and I'm simplifying, exchange their freedom for security. Because what is the point of civil obligation? Why do you follow the law? Because the law protects everybody's property. That's why. So what are you getting? You are getting security of your life, liberty, estates, and properties. What are you giving up? Your natural freedom. There's a Benjamin Franklin quote here that I think will help us understand what Locke's getting at. So this is Franklin. And once again, I'm not trying to say that Locke influenced Franklin, although Franklin surely read Locke. The point is, political cultures have commonplaces. And these are often like the terms of the debate. So even though people are giving you different formulations or different arguments, the terms of the debate and the questions they're addressing are very similar. And here's what Franklin said. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. What Locke is going to say is those who give up some liberty to purchase lasting safety, both liberty and safety. You see how that works? So Locke does not think you've given up your freedom per se. Locke is saying you gave up your natural freedom, you now have civil freedom. Locke is not saying you gave up this essential liberty to get a little temporary safety. Locke is saying your civil society in the long run is going to secure both you and the entire society's life, liberties, estates, and possessions. So that's a point of contrast with Franklin. The subject in a civil society has less freedom than an individual in the state of nature, but they are more secure to enjoy those freedoms. That's how the social contract works. In other words, it's a good trade. Locke thinks this is a good bargain. It is better to have freedoms securely enjoyed than it is to have less limited freedoms that are insecurely enjoyed. Do you see how that works? Less freedom, more secure, is better than more freedom, less secure. And you can talk here about how human beings are risk averse and so forth. It's a very similar idea in Locke. And so what Locke is saying is there's a trade-off and it makes sense. And if you don't believe it, if you don't believe less freedom, more secure is better than more freedom, less secure, just think about a case of a society which has collapsed, a society where all individuals are fighting all other individuals, a society where people are at each other's throat and killing each other all the time, where you can't go down to the market and get some bread or candy or whatever without worrying about being shot and without worrying about having your money stolen from you. Now, in that kind of situation, Locke would say that's a permanent state of war. Now, you have freedom, but you have no security. Would you really rather live in a society like that? And that's Locke trying to play on your anxieties there. That's Locke trying to get you to imagine the worst case scenario of how these inconveniences in the state of nature actually can lead to the state of war. Because people are biased in their own case, and they're often willing to take their own case too far, up to the point of violence. Okay. If the trade-off is to remain advantageous, if this social contract is going to be rational to sign up for, if it's going to be reasonable to actually sign up for the social contract, the government has to meet a key condition. And that condition is the subject's property is actually being secured. So, if the government is not securing the subject's property, it's no longer exercising political power, because you remember, built into the definition of political power is legislating and executing to defend property against threats to property. That's the gist of it. You can go get the formal definition on the other slide. If the government's not meeting that condition, it's no longer exercising political power. If it's no longer exercising political power, the obligation on the subject to obey is no longer there. Okay, the example I have here is taxation. The example here is taxation. So the question for Locke is not how high are the taxes, how low are the taxes? Are the taxes progressive? That is, do people with higher amounts of income pay a greater share of that income? Is it regressive, where people with higher amounts of income pay a lesser share of the income? It's not that. That's not the question. Is it progressive? Is it flat? Is it whatever? That's not what Locke's after. What Locke is saying is, as long as the tax code has been set by law and the proper authorities, you have an obligation to pay taxes. Now, how has it been set? How might this tax code have been set in a proper way according to Locke? Well, according to Locke, if you had representation in that body, say a legislature, that was passing the tax code and setting the tax rates, that will suffice. So the problem is when people try and tax you without your consent, because your wealth, remember, your money is your property, according to Locke, and they're basically trying to take money away from you without your consent. However, if you've been represented in the process that sets the tax code, and it's a law in Locke's sense of the word, and it's impartial and so forth, you've given your consent. Why? Because you've given consent to that government. And why? Because the government is staying within bounds. So it's not some absolute thing where the government can never touch your property or can never collect taxes. That's not what Locke is saying. Locke is saying, though, if the government will be collecting taxes, it has to go through the right procedures, and it has to go through the legislature. Okay,